Hello, everyone. My name is Lovelis, and I'm also here with Becky, Hattie, and Javier. And we will today be sharing our project that we did on the Sudan 2018-2019 revolution for the LSC Advocacy Campaigning and Grassroots Activism course. So, before we dive into our take on this episode of Change, we wanted to first highlight the key arguments that we found in the existing literature on the revolution. So, as you can see from some of the key quotes here, there are a few different narratives that tend to come up within the existing literature. So, some works focus almost exclusively on the civil movement, emphasizing the use of nonviolent tactics and also the role of women. And when I first came to Sudan, this framing led me personally to initially view the whole revolution as a women's revolution, which it is also sometimes referred to as. Another prevalent argument centers on the internal weakening of the regime, specifically the power struggles within the security apparatus. And then, of course, we also have the economic perspective, which frames the revolution as ultimately driven by the economic crisis. So, some of the literature does a great job of tying these different threads together, showing how different factors overlap and influence one another. But for the most part, we found that authors tend to lean into one main story, being it civil mobilization, an economic perspective, or a sort of political security realist viewpoint. So, what's the real story? Well, we're going to share our understanding with you today, breaking it down into four main drivers that we think were behind this episode of Change.
We want to present to you first with the thesis we will develop throughout the presentation, which revolves around the four main drivers that we identify moving forth the Sudanese revolution. Coming at it from a perspective of systems thinking, we are well aware of the complexities and interplays that occur between these four factors. However, we did find it useful to think of it in a linear fashion, and although it may be a simplification, we do not deem it to be an oversimplification, where the economic crisis was the initial spark that led people onto the streets, which in turn lent legitimacy for a certain block of international actors to start making moves in the Sudanese stage, which in turn incentivized and motivated another set of international actors, as we will see, to make moves of their own. And these international pressures were the ones that ultimately allowed for the splitting of the internal security apparatus, which were the people who ultimately drove Bashir out of power.
We have adapted Oxfam's context wheel to break down Sudan's pre-revolution conditions into four key factors: context, institutions, agents, and events. Looking at the context, Sudan experienced a youth boom prior to the revolution. Many young people became central to resistance movements. The country is majority Arab and Muslim, but ethnic and religious minorities, especially in regions like Darfur and the Blue Nile, faced severe marginalization and violence, including ethnic cleansing. Women's rights were severely restricted under the regime's strict interpretation of Sharia law. Sudan is also in a globalized context. After the Arab Spring reshaped regional dynamics, competing powers were vying for influence in the region. Looking at its governance, al-Bashir seized power in a 1989 military coup. His rule was marked by repression, economic failure, and reliance on the state security apparatus to maintain control. In terms of technology, despite the state control over the internet, social media and WhatsApp became critical tools for organizing and mobilization. And looking at Sudan's environment, gold and oil revenues helped al-Bashir sustain patronage networks, and Sudan's place on the Red Sea attracted foreign interest. Looking at the institutions, in terms of the state, the National Congress Party was the ruling party and the main government entity. The Sudanese armed forces were the traditional formal national military presence, and the rapid support forces evolved from militias into a powerful personalized paramilitary under al-Bashir. The National Intelligence and Security Service was critical to maintain surveillance and repression under the regime. On the other side, the youth resistance committees were decentralized activist networks pushing for change at the grassroots level. And the Sudanese Professionals Association was a coalition of unions that became central to mobilizing protests. We'll look at the events in more detail in a moment, but The most important is that the succession of South Sudan triggered an economic crisis by cutting off oil revenues and weakening the patronage system. Meanwhile, civil society and activist groups gained organizing experience, laying the groundwork for revolution.
So here is the timeline for this period of change. The timeline begins in 2011 with a key turning point, Sudan's separation from South Sudan. This led to the loss of 75% of Sudan's oil revenue, plunging the economy into a steep decline. Early signs of unrest appeared during the Arab Spring in 2011 and escalated in 2013, with protests met by violent repression. Fast forward to December 2018, bread prices tripled overnight. This was a critical juncture. In Atbara, schoolgirls took to the streets to protest their unaffordable lunches. These protests quickly spread across Sudan, shifting from economic grievances to calls for political change. This was significant as civilians began to hold Bashir's regime directly accountable for the crisis. A pivotal development came in January 2019 with the signing of the Declaration of Freedom and Change by civilian and rebel groups. This united movement demanded the removal of Bashir, strengthening the coordination of protests led by the Sudanese Professionals Association. Despite Bashir's declaration of a state of emergency in February 2019, protests continued to gain momentum. Another critical juncture occurred on April 6, 2019, marking the anniversary of Sudan's 1985 nonviolent uprising. This showed the regime and the military the power of the movement. Parts of the security forces even started protecting protesters. This day became a powerful symbol of resistance, amplified by viral images like activist Allah Salah leading chants. On April 11, 2019, a turning point was reached when Bashir was overthrown by his own security forces. However, this marked only the beginning of a new phase. The military established a transitional military council, but protesters accused them of engineering a coup and demanded they step aside. Protests persisted and tensions escalated. The situation reached a tragic peak on June 3, 2019, with the Khartoum massacre, a devastating moment in the movement. Over 120 people were killed and dozens were raped as security forces violently dispersed protest camps. This fueled nationwide outrage, leading to a massive demonstration on June 30th. By mid-August 2019, the military and civilian opposition coalition agreed to a power-sharing arrangement, forming a sovereign council with a mix of civilian and military leadership. Shortly after, Abdallah Hamdok, a respected economist, was appointed prime minister to guide Sudan towards democratic elections.
Okay, so now that we have the understanding of the context and the timeline, let us get back to our four main drivers that Javier presented in the beginning. And now we're going to tell you what they're actually about.
The economic collapse in Sudan was the critical trigger for the eventual downfall of al-Bashir. This crisis began in 2011 with the succession of South Sudan, which deprived Sudan of 75% of its oil reserves, previously the backbone of the national economy. Oil had accounted for 50% of government revenues and 95% of exports, leaving Sudan with an enormous revenue gap. The government's response was to turn to austerity measures, exacerbating hardship for ordinary citizens. In 2018, years of economic mismanagement, corruption, and international isolation reached a boiling point. Hyperinflation soared to over 70%, the Sudanese pound lost significant value, and unemployment became rampant. A critical moment came when the government slashed subsidies on bread, tripling prices overnight. For many Sudanese citizens, this was a breaking point. Bread riots erupted in Atbara in December 2018 and quickly spread nationwide, fueled by frustration over years of deprivation. The economic collapse in Sudan not only fueled public discontent, but also destabilized al-Bashir's carefully maintained patronage system. Historically, al-Bashir relied on a system of patronage to consolidate his power, distributing oil revenues among key military, security, and political elites to ensure their loyalty. Al-Bashir faced a growing financial crisis, and the state became unable to pay salaries, sustain subsidies, or maintain the benefits elites had come to expect. To maintain elite loyalty during the economic downturn, al-Bashir allowed military factions, particularly the Rapid Support Forces, to secure alternative revenue streams independent of the state. The RSF, led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemeti, became increasingly powerful by controlling Sudan's lucrative gold mining industry. Hemeti's forces operated in Jebel Amir, an area rich in gold deposits, and generated millions of dollars annually, positioning the RSF as a financial and military powerhouse. In essence, the economic crisis eroded Bashir's ability to sustain his patronage system and shifted power into the hands of factions like RSF, which ultimately decided his fate. This illustrates how economic factors not only sparked grassroots mobilization, but also disrupted the internal dynamics of elite power, paving the way for regime change.
Okay, moving now on to the social drivers of the revolution, and specifically talking about mobilization. Let's first examine how the National Congress Party under Bashir worked to suppress dissent. For decades, they implemented 5 key strategies. First, they created a strong repressive security apparatus. Second, they employed divide and rule tactics to splinter the opposition. They also controlled the media, which allowed them to shape the narrative. They also created an opaque political system that hindered any kind of planning and mobilization from the opposition. And finally, they carefully calibrated their repression they carried out, avoiding to push people too far. But we'll see how it was the severe economic downturn that ultimately pushed people beyond the threshold and provided the impetus for collective action. Before we move on to look at the key elements of social mobilization in Sudan during this time, let's consider the framework or a framework for when collective action does occur. McCarty and colleagues highlight 3 critical elements: a sense of injustice, a belief that participation will lead to change, known as group efficacy, and a shared identity amongst those involved. Efficacy in this sense is amplified then by 2 factors: a strong identification with the movement and the movement's sheer size. The larger the movement, the more social support it garners, and the greater the belief that action will be effective, creating, therefore, a powerful feedback loop. It's this formation of a mass opposition movement where individuals see themselves as part of a coherent group that is essential for large-scale social mobilization. Okay, turning now to the key elements of civil mobilization, let's first look at the breadth and depth of civil resistance. The Sudanese revolution was unique in its diverse and nationwide scale. Unlike previous movements that have been confined to certain regions, only involved certain ethnic groups or classes, this uprising occurred in all regions with a very diverse participation. It was precisely this widespread mobilization that made suppression extremely difficult. And by spreading the actions broadly, it also lowered the perceived risk of joining in, encouraging even greater numbers to join in. This unity was very clearly demonstrated when the government tried to pinpoint the blame of the initial protest on the Darfurian population, and people in Khartoum started chanting, "We are all Darfur," and vice versa. Then people in Darfur started chanting, "We are all Khartoum," in this sense, symbolizing the overcoming of attempts by the regime to divide the protesters. The movement also avoided stagnation by employing a wide array of nonviolent tactics. These included marches, rallies, sit-ins, and strikes. They included actions addressing different issues and mobilizing different constituencies, women's rights, freeing political prisoners, for instance. This diversity helped maintain momentum and prevented participation fatigue, a common pitfall in this kind of long-term movement. Another crucial aspect was the effective coordination between national opposition groups like the Sudanese Professional Association and local resistance committees. These grassroots committees acted as vital links, disseminating information received through social media to those without access. They served as on-the-ground base for the national movement, ensuring that directives and messages reached even the most local and remote communities. Fourth, women also played a very significant role in the revolution. Their presence boosted protester numbers and added a valuable perspective that emphasized nonviolence, discipline, and democratic processes. the symbolic use of the Sagarit as the call to the streets, the call to protest, was very important as well. And even though the role of women features very prominently in the literature, it is also important to acknowledge, however, that women were underrepresented in the top leadership positions of the Forces of Freedom and the SPA. The revolution also effectively countered the regime's narratives. When the regime tried to portray opposition as anti-Islamic, activists reframed them as merchants of religion exploiting faith for power. The use of a culture of resistance, which included murals, conveyed solidarity, hope, and defiance. Social media was also instrumental in spreading news, linking the diaspora to the movement and garnering international support, as we've mentioned in our thesis. Finally, but very importantly, the opposition strategically exploited divisions within the regime's power structures. They exacerbated existing tensions within and between the security apparatus, including the police, intelligence, military, and special forces, and they managed to turn these divisions to their advantage. They also engaged with business leaders, oligarchs in particular, persuading them to withdraw support from the regime. And this was crucial to allow for the two general strikes that largely shut down the country during the revolution itself. As a wrap up for this section, we have that the Sudanese revolution offers a profound challenge to conventional Western narratives about uprisings and democratization in the global south. Often, these narratives overlook or downplay the agency of local populations, instead emphasizing external influences or geopolitical factors. However, the Sudanese experience unequivocally demonstrates the powerful initiative and strategic thinking of the Sudanese people themselves.
One often overlooked factor in al-Bashir's fall is the role of international actors. On the left, I've listed the main foreign players with stakes in Sudan. You'll see their interests range from economic projects to geopolitical competition. On the right, I've used Rollin's four powers to map the levers that they could pull to influence change, including financial backing, peace mediation, political recognition, and so on. But let's focus on the two most consequential cases, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. In the wake of the Arab Spring, both countries adopted more assertive regional policies to counter political Islam and expand their influence. Sudan became a key battleground in this shift. Al-Bashir, short on cash after South Sudan's succession and seeking legitimacy, tried to balance both camps. He deployed RSF troops to Yemen to support the Saudi-led coalition in return for financial aid. At the same time, he maintained ties with Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the UAE's biggest regional rival. This double game backfired. In December 2018, the UAE halted fuel shipments. Soon after, al-Bashir slashed bread subsidies, triggering the first mass protests that ultimately led to the revolution. As unrest escalated, the Gulf states shifted their strategy. Saudi Arabia and the UAE were motivated by a desire to prevent a democratic transition that could empower Islamist forces, as they feared that successful uprisings in Sudan may be contagious and could pose a threat to their centralized authoritarian monarchies. In March 2019, a regional meeting in Cairo, convened by Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, reportedly greenlit plans for a military coup. They reached out to General Burhan and Hemeti, both of whom had worked closely with Gulf forces in Yemen. Al-Bashir refused exile offers. In late April, the UAE reportedly delivered weapons to Hemeti, and both countries pledged $3 billion to the Transitional Military Council, including $500 million directly deposited into Sudan's central bank, and additional support through civil society co-optation, with the UAE hosting opposition figures in Abu Dhabi and offering incentives to back the military leadership. This support helped tip the balance of power toward the military, enabling the split in the security apparatus that ultimately led to al-Bashir's fall.
So, the last driver important for this change episode, we believe, is the shifts within Sudan's elite power structures, mainly within the security apparatus. So before the revolution, Bashir here, who is at the top of the slide, and his party placed a lot of effort in keeping his security apparatus operational and powerful. But he also understood the risks of giving them too much power because he was afraid that if he gave them too much power, they would overthrow him just like he did when he came to power in 1989. So, what he did was to deliberately keep them separate from each other, reduce their ability to communicate and coordinate with one another, and also, to the extent possible, tie their fates to his own. So, the main security actors that I'm talking about here is the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, which was sort of the most professionalized army that he had under him. Then we have the National Intelligence Security Service, or NIS for short, that was sort of the secret police. And then lastly, the Rapid Support Forces, which was formed from the 2013 Janjaweed militia. So, what was happening then with these different security forces and within the security apparatus that was such a significant change? Well, in the years leading up to the revolution, these security forces began to gain more independent access to sources of revenue. So, for instance, Hemeti, who was the leader of RSF and is the fourth person on this slide, he was making money from the gold mines in Darfur and from participating in the war in Yemen. SAF, on the other hand, or the Sudanese armed forces, moved into commercial industries like meat processing, telecoms, and sesame production. And Bashir then sort of let this happen, probably because he wanted to keep the security actors and their leaders happy, to put it simply, but ultimately it meant that they became less dependent on him. And as one author, Deval, points out, Bashir's then centralized kleptocracy shifted towards a more of a collusive oligopoly, where power and resources were distributed more broadly to the security forces and other political elites managing these now new revenue streams. So, in our course's terms, what we have learned is that he was sort of losing power over these other actors. And when the protests erupted in 2018, it is therefore not that surprising that the forces in the end turned on Bashir. What is also interesting is that SAF appeared more sympathetic to the protesters. On April 6, one of our critical junctures that Hadi talked about in the beginning on our timeline, some SAF soldiers began protecting demonstrators from the secret police, or NIS, and began giving them water and even joining in the revolutionary chants. So some SAF soldiers were even killed defending this sit in. This could also be explained with some of the youth within SAF feeling the power within or the power with the protesters and having more in common with them than actually the force itself. So, this is sort of where our story ends. We have now kind of gone through the four main drivers that we believe were critical for this episode of change to happen. We also did do a power analysis to kind of show it in a different way. And the main part of that is in a video that we're going to show you in a minute. But first, just to show that we also did a power cube analysis where we analyzed the forms, spaces, and levels of power. And I think the main conclusions that we really could draw here was that civilians did gain visible power in the transitional government that was the outcome of the power sharing agreement. Also, the new government did remove some of the gender discriminating policies and laws that were in place before. So, in a very simply put way, women did gain power in this transition. However, in the new government, there was still a hierarchy with the military at the top, and there were also tensions between the civilian representatives and the rest of the civilian coalition that supported the revolution. And also, Bashir's military successors ultimately preserved the sort of authoritarian infrastructure of the regime as well. So we've put this as sort of a hidden power that remained even after the revolution. However, we also think it is important not to underestimate the impact of the revolution on the increased capacity and sort of power of civil society and of the people of Sudan. And I think it's important to mention also today, Sudan's civil society is always a bit neglected. Today in the war, there is quite a binary media framing of the two warlords against each other, which doesn't really show the agency and important role that these community groups do play and have also played during the ongoing crisis in Sudan. So the capacities and power resources that they have today can also be seen as a legacy of what they gained during the revolution. On that note, we're going to end here with showing you a video using a power map to show sort of everything that we've talked about, how power changed from before the revolution until after. We hope you like it. So the map will show different groups involved in this change episode, grouped by color here on the left, and will pop up as bubbles in a second, to show how power dynamics between them and their support for the regime changed over time. Before the revolution in November 2018, power was concentrated in al-Bashir's regime, so up in the top left corner. You can see himself, his political party directly under him, and also his huge security apparatus that he had in green. The community groups are in the bottom right corner, and although they had been active for a long time, they were quite disconnected for various reasons, but also because al-Bashir's government suppressed civil society and famously used divide and rule tactics. However, in December 2018, protests broke out across Sudan due to rising living costs, and these protests quickly became political, with people demanding al-Bashir's removal. As more groups joined, their connections grew stronger, symbolized by the red lines here on the map and the pulsing kind of heart of the movement. Women's groups were particularly active in leading the protests, and you can see here how art communities and even the Sudanese diaspora started to come together. And this whole group came together under chants and joint slogans for the protests that demanded al-Bashir's fall. A key player in organizing these protests was the Sudanese Professionals Association, or SPA, that you can see in the middle of the pink actors, which connected also the movement to the opposition political parties and the Sudan Revolutionary Front that you can see in the kind of upper right corner. The Sudan Revolutionary Front was a coalition of armed groups and rebels. By January 2019, all these groups came together to form a coalition called the Forces of Freedom and Change. And together, they then demanded al-Bashir's resignation. So they were almost 22 actors that came together jointly and very visibly to demand his fall. This movement was so powerful that al-Bashir decided to declare a state of emergency. But in the end, that only added to the panic within his own party, which is sort of symbolized here. And as the protests grew, security forces started distancing themselves from al-Bashir as well. And they started to negotiate with regional powers that you can see here in blue, and started to make sort of deals with them to sort of guarantee their own survival in the case that Bashir would fall. All these different power factors combined, the big movement and these different deals that the security forces were making, in the end made them overthrow al-Bashir. And so al-Bashir was gone, and instead a transitional military council was formed on the 12th of April. So this isn't the formal kind of end of the Sudanese revolution, because protests did continue after this, and in the end a civilian transitional government was formed. But this is where the power map ends, to show how al-Bashir fell and what type of power dynamics was left after that. So thank you so much for listening.